Hey everybody, my name is Josh from StonebondConstruction.com, and today we're going to be showcasing some of the great things that you can do with Stonebond epoxy. From time to time we're going to be placing videos on our site that show the many projects that can be done around your house. The possibilities truly are endless. Today what we're going to be working on is a piece of black walnut. It's actually a live edge slab that we're making a table out of. And what that live edge, what that means is that the bark has been left on the piece of wood. So it's a very rustic looking table. And what we're going to do, we're going to be putting our Stonebond epoxy on there as a decoupage, which is going to give it a very wet look. But before we get to that point, we're going to need to put a base coat or a primer coat of urethane. And what that's going to do is make sure that the wood is nice and sealed, and it will allow the epoxy to gel on top and make it look a lot deeper and a lot more intense. It's going to be a great project, so let's take a look at it. Alright, so we're here with our slab of black walnut, and all we're going to do right now is put a base coat of urethane onto this wood. That's going to help seal it up. It's going to make a better finished product when we're done. We're using regular urethane, but I am using a very cheap brush. Now there is a chance that you could lose bristles while you're doing this. If we were using this with a top coat, it could potentially be an issue, but since we're using this for the base coat, this will be getting a light sanding before the final coat. So if we do lose any bristles, it shouldn't be a big deal. Furthermore, when you use epoxy, you're better off just throwing the brush away instead of trying to clean it out, and so we usually go with cheaper brushes. So let's begin. As you can see, the urethane is being applied, and this is what you can expect to find. The urethane really brings out the color of the wood. It's a nice, rich, wet look. However, I must let you know that this is nothing compared to what it will look like once the Stonebond epoxy has been applied to the top. We have completely coated the entire slab with our high gloss urethane. Now you can really use any kind of urethane. We just had high gloss, and that's what we used. Now as you look at this piece of wood, you're probably noticing that it looks a little bit grainy, and that's okay, because once this urethane dries, we're going to go back over it and lightly sand it, and that's going to knock down any rough edges, and it's going to make the final application of the epoxy even better. Once the epoxy is on the tabletop, it's going to add a lot of depth. It's going to completely change the way this piece of wood looks. One of the things you might have noticed is the many different colors in the wood. And that's one of the great things about using epoxy for a decoupage project is that it's going to really highlight all of these things. But here in the middle of your screen, you'll notice a dark line running through the table. And that was actually a split in the wood, and we were able to essentially camouflage it using epoxy, as well as some of the sawdust from this tabletop. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Here you'll see this is the dust from when we would sand this table, and we simply mixed a little bit of this dust with a little bit of the Stonebond epoxy, and it was able to turn into a paste, and we were able to fill these cracks and the knot holes. It's smooth, it looks natural, and it's just one of the many things you can do with our epoxy. As you can see, we are back. Our tabletop has sat for 24 hours. We've finished sanding the entire top. And essentially what we were doing is roughing up the primer coat of urethane that we had placed on there and knocking down any rough edges that may have come up. What we're going to do now is we're going to thoroughly blow off this slab of wood, and then we're going to use a tack cloth, which is something that you would use, say, if you were getting ready to paint a car, and that tack cloth will take any excess dust off of the surface. So when we come back, we will have mixed the epoxy, and we will be getting ready to put the top coat onto our tabletop. Here we are mixing our epoxy. This is a very easy to use epoxy. It mixes in a 1-to-1 ratio. Unlike the epoxies that you would find at the big box stores, this is an oil-based epoxy. It is not water-based. and it is much more durable and long-lasting. One of the things to keep in mind when mixing this epoxy is you want to mix it by hand. Here, since we're using a small amount, we're simply using a paint stir to mix it, but you want to make sure that you mix it by hand. If you would attempt to mix it with a power drill in a manner like you would with grout or mortar or something like that with a paddle, you're going to incorporate way too much air into the mixture, and it will ruin your epoxy. So you always want to make sure that you mix it by hand. Now, it's imperative that before you begin the final process of placing the top coat of epoxy on your table, you want to make sure that you are working on a level surface. If not, your product is going to run off in the direction that the table is lowest, and you're going to end up with a puddle on the floor. So for this project, we're making sure that we're level, and then we're going to actually pour out our epoxy on top. For this application, we are ready to go. All right, so here we are. We're pouring on our top coat of epoxy. And it may not look like we're using a whole lot, and it may turn out that we need a little bit more than what we have started out with. But like most things in life, a little bit will go a long way. Now, it's important to remember when you're working with Stonebond epoxy that it is very unique, and it is different than the products you will get at your big box stores. It's much different than urethane. It's a completely different product. While you could do this product with a high gloss urethane, what you need to understand is that you're going to be able to accomplish in one coat what it may take 10 to 15 coats of high gloss urethane to accomplish. You also need to be aware that our epoxy is much more UV stable than urethane. And what that means is that our epoxy is clearer than urethane. I'm sure if you've worked with urethane in the past, you know that the more coats you apply, the darker the product will become. And you know, if you add 10, 12, 13 coats of urethane, you will end up with a slight amber color to the product. And by using our epoxy on this on this project, we're able to ensure that we're going to have a crystal clear surface that's going to highlight the wood. It's going to showcase the beauty of the product, and it's going to do a much better overall job than urethane. As you can see, the top coat of epoxy has been applied to our tabletop. And what we're doing now is using a small propane torch to flash the epoxy. And what that's doing is it's going to remove all of the air pockets and little air bubbles that could be in the epoxy. Maybe it came from the mixing, maybe it came from when we brushed it on. Doesn't matter. This small flame will remove that air and provide us with a smooth, clear top coat. You could do this with a hair dryer. We just happen to be using a small propane torch. Once this is completed, we will allow the table to sit for a minimum of 24 hours, and then we will come back and we will show you the overall finished product. Here you can see that we have finished the flashing process. The top coat of epoxy is on. We're going to allow it to sit for a full 24 hours before we touch it again. Just a little note, as you are using your small propane torch to flash the epoxy, make sure that you take your time and go over it fairly lightly. You don't want to overheat the epoxy. You don't want to scorch the epoxy. It will burn. So you don't want to be right on top of it. You want to keep your torch moving, and you want to stay a little bit off of the surface and just allow the residual heat to help bring the air bubbles to the surface. This is the finished product. To recap, what we've done is we've used a slab piece of black walnut. We left the bark on the edges. That's called a live edge. We sanded the tabletop, and then we applied Stonebond epoxy for a high gloss finish. And as you can see, the results are beautiful. Now, the tabletop is sitting on a tree trunk, and if you're curious, that is actually a tree trunk from a redbud tree. All of this was made possible with a little bit of hard work and Stonebond epoxy.